Hey Steven, who paid us more money to make this comparison, Nikon or Sony? Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a comparison between the Nikon Z7 and the Sony a7R IV. Now, before we get in too far, I've done real-world reviews of both of these cameras. You can check them out at the links below, as well as download sample RAW files so that you can pixel peep them for yourself to see which one you like better than the other. So as you can see, we've got the Z7 right here, the a7R IV right here, and normally right here, we would put a Canon camera, but they don't exactly have a camera that fits this hole. Maybe one day they will have a high megapixel mirrorless camera that can compete with what Nikon and Sony has done, but up until this point, they have not, and that's why these two are right here. Now let's start with how many megapixels we have with the sensors. The Z7 has a 45.7 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor. The Sony a7R IV has a 61 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor. Now that is a big difference between 61 and 45.7. At the time when Nikon came out with this was a very similar sensor to what Sony had in the a7R III. Now that they have the a7R IV out, you have 61 megapixels. I'm personally leaning more this way to give a check mark to this because it's more. Doesn't exactly mean it's better in all situations, as we will see when we go forward with the specs, but in this case, I'm giving a check mark to the a7R IV. You'll get a check mark. And also, let me add that the a7R IV will give you a 124 megabyte RAW file in the 14-bit uncompressed, and the Z7 will give you right around 100 megabyte RAW file when you are shooting uncompressed 14-bit. So they do chew up a lot of extra space. Moving on to the mounts in these cameras, the Nikon Z7 has a Z mount, the a7R IV has a E mount, whichever way the E goes, and which one is better is obviously up for debate, and that's why we're here to talk about it. I love the Z mount. It is a massive Z mount, which means in the future you can get bigger hunks of glass that may possibly be smaller and lighter versus what you could have done on the F mount. Now, up until this point, they do not have an f1.2 lens that you can put natively on this camera. Now, with that being said, they do have a 0.95 Noct, which is $8,000 and is manually focusing, which is absolutely stupid. Shame on you, Nikon. I mean, not really shame on you, but that is a stupid lens for this camera that nobody's actually gonna buy. And on the E-mount side, you hear a lot of complaints that they can't get 1.2 glass because their mount is smaller. That is true, their mount is smaller, and I'm not sure that that's going to be a big deterrent in the future, but you can get a 35 1.2 from Sigma, which I've used as my go-to lens when using the a7R IV, and it works perfectly fine. Now, here's the thing. You can get an adapter, the F to Z adapter on the Z7, which allows you to bring a lot of different F-mount lenses to work on this camera. In my experience, when I'm using Z glass as well as the F to Z adapter, it's a pain in the ass to switch from one to the other, because sometimes I take the lens off of the adapter and then try to put a Z lens onto the adapter. Instead of taking the adapter off, it becomes a pain in the ass and you might miss shots. Whereas with the E-mount, all native E-mount glass will fit onto this without an adapter. So where does the check mark go? Nobody's getting a check mark because I haven't decided which one's better as of yet, because they both can do similar things. The images that you're seeing on the screen right now were taken with both of these cameras and edited using FroPak 1. Now, if you're looking to speed up your workflow or have a much better starting point, we created FroPak 1, which is 14 custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/presets. Over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and afters, and if you decide to pick them up, they are currently 40% off. So go ahead and take advantage of that discount. Moving on to ISO, the Z7 will go from 64 to 25,600 natively, expandable up to 102,400, with the a7R IV going from 100 to 32,000, expandable up to 102,400. Now here we go. 64 ISO is fantastic. That's going to be great for landscapers. That's going to give you your best dynamic range. It's 64 ISO. This at 100 ISO is very good. Now keep in mind, when you have 61 megapixels squeezed into the same size sensor that you have 45.7 of this is probably going to be cleaner at higher ISOs. I've had to change my style of shooting when I'm shooting both of these cameras. I used to shoot with a D5 and a D4 and similar with like an A9, and I like to bump the ISO up to give me a faster shutter speed. Well, in these cameras, I've dropped the ISO because I don't want to have more noise or grain in the images, which means I have a slower shutter speed, but that's okay because you have IBIS built into both of these cameras. So in terms of ISO, who gets the check mark? Who? It reminds me of a song. So make a note, Steven. There's a new song like, who gets the check mark? Who? Nikon gets the check mark. That's who, because 64 ISO with less megapixels is going to be cleaner at higher ISOs. Moving on to frame rates. Now the Z7 will give you 9 frames a second, but you're in 12-bit RAW in high extended mode, so you're not getting 14-bit. Now I shoot it in 14-bit and get 5.5 frames a second in the normal high mode. I prefer getting 14-bit over 12-bit because you're buying this camera, why don't you shoot it at the highest bit rate to get the best color and the most data through the camera as possible. Now on the Sony side, you can shoot 10 frames a second with the mechanical or electronic shutter, 8 frames a second in uncompressed RAW. I am not reaching 8 frames a second with this camera when I'm shooting. I have seen it be about 6.5 frames a second, which, keep in mind, you're moving 124 megabyte files through this camera at 6.5 frames a second, and it holds up pretty well. They're not blazing fast, but for the amount of data that you're moving through, they are pretty darn fast. So who gets the check mark this time around? I guess I'm gonna have to go with the A7R IV, because even dumbed down, and dumbed down is actually dumbed up because it's the 14-bit, you're still getting more frames per second than you are with the Z7. Since we just got frames per second out of the way, which one can shoot longer continuously, aka the burst rate? The Z7 will give you 18 RAW files in a row in the uncompressed 14-bit. The A7R IV will give you 33 RAW files. You basically can shoot for 6 whole seconds in uncompressed RAW without outrunning that camera. And only 18, puny 18, Nikon. Why are you only 18? Well, at least it's legal. But I prefer the A7R IV in this case, which means who gets the check mark? Sony. Sony. How many focusing points do these cameras have? Well, the Nikon Z7 has 493-point phase detect AF system. It does offer you IAF. It gives you edge-to-edge focusing, but the issue is you cannot switch between IAF and any of the focusing points while you have IAF activated. Whereas with the Sony, you can actually move the focusing point while IAF is active. So how many focusing points are in this Sony? 567-point phase detect AF system, you have IAF, you have lock-on tracking, you have edge-to-edge focusing, and you can pick that focusing point just like I said. IAF in the Sony blows everything else out of the water up until this point, including the Z7. It has IAF, it does work, but I can't trust it as much as with the A7R IV. I've used them both in the real world, and the IAF of this body right here is far superior, and that's why it gets a check mark for IAF. Now, what about for general autofocusing? Well, you've got dynamic area AF in this camera, which basically fills the whole frame, as you can see from the electronic viewfinder. It's like a bunch of big boxes, and you're not sure what it's actually doing. You have lock-on tracking and IAF always active in the Sony. I just can't stress enough that this has changed the game for me as a photojournalist, how good IAF is and lock-on tracking. This does what I want it to do. This does not do what I want it to do, which means you get the check mark, Sony. You do. Let me jump in here real quick and let you know that this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you're looking to build your own online photo portfolio, I highly suggest you go to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto to take advantage of your 14-day no credit card needed trial. Now, if you decide that it's for you, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Now let's get back to the video. Now we're moving on to video mode, and no, these cameras are not primarily used to shoot videos, but they do have that option. Now we are using a Nikon Z6 right now in the studio. Actually, we're using two of them. There's like one right down there, right there, and there's one right there that we use in the studios because we love the colors, we love the tones, we love the sharpness, and they're locked off in terms of autofocus, so we don't have to worry about the autofocusing. But the Z7 will give you full frame 4K with pixel binning. Now in DX cropped mode, you get 4K oversampled from 5K without pixel binning. You can do 10-bit 422 with N-Log to an external recorder with a slight crop, and you can do 1080p at up to 120 frames per second. Like I said, Nikon did a fantastic job with the Z6 and Z7 updating the video features to actually make them usable. Now, the Sony, on the other hand, gives you full frame 4K with pixel binning. In Super 35 mode, you get 4K oversampled from 6K without pixel binning and 1080p at 120 frames per second, but there is no 10-bit option for external recording. So who gets the check mark? I'm gonna hold off on that check mark because we need to talk about autofocus for video because that's gonna help determine which one of these is better. What's gonna help determine it. Now, you have auto area AF and subject tracking, which is similar to dual pixel AF in the Z7. Now, you can adjust the tracking speed, but it's not the best autofocus that you can get. Whereas on the A7R4 side, you have movie IAF with real-time tracking and unlimited record time. So no longer do you get just $29.59, which you get in the Z7, you will get unlimited record time. Or, as I like to say, unlimited record time. Kind of like the ring of that. So which one is better for video? Well, in terms of autofocus, we're going with the Sony all day, every day. In terms of if you want the best of the best of the best quality, well, you can do 10-bit 422 externally to an external recorder in the Z7. But if I had to pick overall which one I would end up going with, I'm probably going with the Sony because of the lock-on tracking and the real-time IAF for video. You can't beat that with a stick, and I even tried to beat it with a stick, and you couldn't beat it. Continuing on, let's talk about IBIS. The Z7 has it. You've got 5-axis in-body VR, and the Sony has 5-axis in-body steady shot for up to 5.5 stops. Now, we've always noticed that the Sony is a little more finicky with the image stabilization for video, and in turn, it's going to be very similar for when you're shooting photos, so be careful there. With the Nikon, we've handheld this at super slow shutter speeds, and their IBIS kicked in and did a fantastic job. So this time around for IBIS, we're going to check mark the Nikon viewfinders. We've got them. We've got two EVFs right here with the Nikon coming in at 3.69 million dot electronic viewfinder, and the Sony has a 5.76 million dot EVF. I love both of these EVFs, but I love one of them more. Can you guess which one I love more? Is it you, Nikon? Is it you, Sony? It's the Sony. It's just a beautiful electronic viewfinder. So 2 check marks for beautiful viewfinder goes to the Sony. Since we just talked about EVFs, let's talk about the LCD screens on the back of these cameras. On the Nikon, you have a 3.2-inch, 2.1 million dot tilting touchscreen, which I absolutely love. The color, the quality, the tones, they're beautiful on the back of the Nikon. Now on the Sony side, you have a 3-inch, 1.4 million dot tilting touchscreen LCD. Now, I'll just say that the touchscreen functions are terrible on this camera. Why are they terrible? Because you can't actually touch the menu system. So I actually deactivate the touch options in this camera because my nose or my finger always uses the touch to drag by accident and moves my focusing point where I don't want it to be. Now, you can't actually touch and drag the Nikon focusing points either, but the screen on the Sony is honestly terrible for reviewing your images. Anytime I review an image on the Sony, I'm looking through the awesome electronic viewfinder. Anytime I show the camera to somebody, I make them look through the electronic viewfinder because it's more vibrant, more saturated, more colorful, more crisp, more better. Which means you lose a check mark. -1 check mark for Sony, +1 check mark for Nikon. You got the check mark. Let me jump in here real quick and say if you'd like to take better pictures in only 11 days, I created a free mini video course that you can sign up for right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/11 days. Now I want to talk about some extra features that these cameras offer to see if one of them gets a check mark for that feature or not. The Nikon will give you 8K time-lapse, but you do need to stitch that together in post. But 8K time-lapse is pretty good. It is a nice feature to have if you do a lot of landscapes. Honestly, this is a fantastic landscape camera because you don't have to worry about the autofocus as much, and you can shoot at 64 ISO. This is a great landscape camera, and that 8K time-lapse is awesome. On the Sony side, you can do a 16-shot pixel shift, which is giving you a 240 megapixel image. Now, pixel shift is pretty cool because it's going to give you a massive, highly detailed, high-quality image that's made from 16 images. Look, it's usable, but it depends on your situation. If you're shooting something that's moving, you're really not going to get away with using pixel shift because it's just going to ghost and give you some interesting artifacts. But it is a nice feature to have if it comes in handy for you. So I'm not giving a check mark here because they both have their pros and cons. So who has the nicest body up here between the Z7 and the A7R IV? I don't know, we're gonna talk about that. I really love how the Nikon Z7 feels in the hand. It's shaped well, ergonomics are very good, the buttons are in the right place. The rubber feels much better than how the rubber feels in the Sonys. Now with that being said, Sony has updated the A7R IV to the new body design, which feels much better in the hands because it's beefier, it has a deeper grip, it just feels good. With that being said, the rubber still feels very plasticky and a little more slippery than the Nikon. So in terms of body feel and rubber feel, Nikon gets a check mark for great rubber because the rubber feels good. With that being said though, you see the grip on this? This one has a vertical grip that doubles as an extra battery pack because you can put 2 batteries in it. It has dials and it has buttons and it has joysticks and it has function. Where Nikon, they didn't make a vertical grip. They made a battery pack that has no buttons, it has no dials, it has no function other than to add an extra battery to this freaking camera. It is stupid. So Nikon, you lose 15 check marks for stupidity, which puts you in the hole. You're much better, Sony, because you have a vertical grip. Another feature that these cameras offer you is USB-C charging, except one of them allows you to charge while you're shooting. This is charging, like, in basketball, that's a charge, and in hockey, it's 1 revolution. Don't do multiple revolutions because actually that's traveling. Whatever, same thing. So to have the option of charging while shooting is much better than having the option of charging and then staring at your camera saying, when are you gonna have enough juice so I can shoot again? So check mark goes to Sony. Here's a minor feature that sets both of these cameras apart. The Nikon Z7's joystick is a little more dainty and the knipples aren't as present. Whereas on the A7R IV, you have a bigger joystick on the back, which is upgraded, and it has better feeling knipples. I like better feeling knipples, so check mark goes to Sony. Moving on to another controversial thing that the Z7 has, or doesn't have, it has 1 card slot. Now, it has a great card slot because it's XQD, and I love XQD cards, except for the fact it just has 1, and I like having 2. Speaking of 2, you have 2 UHS 2 SD card slots in the A7R IV. You don't have XQD. You need XQD. It needs XQD. Sony, make a bigger body, put XQD cards in here or CF Express cards because this camera demands better cards. I'm not a fan of SD cards, though you can get the new tough cards from Sony, which are basically 1 piece. They're more tough. You can't really break them unless you really try hard. They don't have that stupid lock switch that if that lock switch falls off, you'll lose all of your data. So I'm not a big fan of that, but you do have 2 card slots, and when you shoot redundant, if 1 card fails, you have the second one there. Check mark. Well, nobody's getting a check mark because it should be CF Express. Now let's talk about battery life. A lot of people like to bitch and moan that battery life isn't good in mirrorless cameras. I was one of those people 5 years ago. If you're still bitching about it, maybe you haven't tried a modern day mirrorless camera, so shut up about your bitching about battery power because you should get 600, 700, 800 shots out of the stills when you're just doing stills with the Z7. On the Sony side, 6, 7, 800 shots per battery, and with the grip you get 2 batteries, so that's a good thing. And if you just think you're cool and you want to have a Z7 with a very terrible feeling battery grip, you can get an extra battery into that one and get roughly 1.6 times more battery life. Nobody gets a check mark because they're batteries, and they do a pretty good job now. Let me jump in here real quick and say if you're looking to purchase either of these 2 cameras or trade in some old gear towards new cameras, check out allenscamera.com. Now, they've been around since the late 70s. They are a mom and pop store that supported me when I first started FroKnowsPhoto, and I like to support them by going there and making my purchases. So for more information, go to allenscamera.com, and don't forget to tell them the Fro sent you. If weight is important to you, then you are gonna like the Nikon because it is 1.29 pounds or 585 grams, whereas the Sony body only without the grip is 1.46 pounds or 665 grams. There's not much difference between the weight. They both feel fine in terms of weight, so neither of them, aka neither of them, are actually getting a check mark, which brings us to the most important tests of all on my channel: the wind tunnel test and the sniff test. So let's start with the sniff test. A little oaky, a little cherry. Yeah, Sony smells better. Sony wins the check mark because it smells better. Now, wind tunnel test is super important. For those of you who are new here, the wind tunnel test is super scientific. I blow on these cameras and then tell you which one handled it better. We're gonna use this iPad as like an accelerator. The wind goes well over the Nikon, much better because it doesn't have a vertical grip. So because it doesn't have a vertical grip, it's now actually a positive because it wins the wind tunnel test. Congratulations, Nikon! You won something for not having a grip. Now let's talk about price and wrap this bad boy up. The Nikon comes in at $2796.95 with a free F to Z adapter. This is a lot less expensive than it was when it originally came out. Where the A7R4 clocks in at $3,498, but you don't need an adapter. But if you want to add a grip, that's going to cost you an extra $300+. That is a $700 difference. I didn't just add that up. We figured it out before the video so I could look like I know what I'm doing, but $700 difference. Yeah, that is a lot of money at this point. The big question is, which one do you go with? Yes, the Sony has more check marks, but the Nikon is less expensive. If you are heavily invested in Nikon glass and Nikon gear and you like the Nikon system and you're doing landscapes and you want that high megapixel with some video features, this is a great option, and for the price, it is a very good camera. If you demand 2 card slots, if you demand a functioning vertical grip with battery pack, then you're going to go with the Sony a7R IV, even if it's more expensive. If you already have an a7R III, you may not be looking at this camera, but we'll have a separate video talking about this camera versus the a7R III. If I had to choose, and I did have to choose, by the way, I chose you, Pikachu. I chose the a7R IV. This was chosen by me because of the 2 card slots, even though they're SD, the vertical grip, the lock-on tracking, and IAF. Those are the functions that I wanted. Do I need 61 megapixels? No, but I took this into the real world on a Bernie Sanders campaign trail and absolutely loved what I got out of it. It gave me what I wanted. I chose this over the Nikon, and I've been a Nikon shooter since I was 15 years old. I think for the next 2 years, personally, and now I say 2 years because I think at that point Nikon may have a different type of body with better IAF and just upgrades, but I'm going with Sony myself for the next couple years because this body gives me exactly what I wanted. As a working professional, you should be able to afford the difference of that $700. If you're not a working professional and you're just somebody who likes to go out and shoot and you like Nikons, take that extra $700 and invest it in some glass. My check mark is going to the Sony. I give Sony the check mark overall to win this video. What do you think? Who gets the check mark? Say it with me. Who gets the check mark? Who? Leave it down in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And that is where I'm gonna leave it. Jared. Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.